So with that being said, we're going to kind of hop over real quick and we will talk about the new Microsoft DNS vulnerability, codenamed SIGRED. Okay. When we talk about DNS, it's important for us to really understand what DNS is first. And this is one of the reasons why we do this stream, is because we see this in the news, and there's all sorts of alarms that come off whenever vulnerabilities like this get released. You see the internet really kind of boil over, with just a massive amount of freak out, if you will, when some of these vulnerabilities exist, especially when we talk about vulnerabilities in Microsoft and the guys here at Check Point. So Check Point is a company, they do a lot of hardware, things like firewalls, things like switches and whatnot. And so, they're doing a ton of research constantly out there to try to identify new threat vectors and new exploits that are going on out there. And so they're a decently respectable company. When we talk about DNS, what we're really talking about is what's known as the domain name system. Now, for those who are tuning in and may not necessarily be cyber savvy, we're gonna kind of level set you on what DNS stands for. For those who are a little bit more experienced, just buckle in and get ready for the ride, because we need to bring everybody along with us, right? So when you look across, usually like the URL bar up here at the top of your browser, in this case I'm using Safari, right? This is what most people are used to seeing when they browse the internet, right? It's a very human-friendly name, right? That's a domain name. What you may or may not necessarily realize is that there's a complex series of ones and zeros that are kind of actually happening on the back end of that domain that allows your computer, when you put in www.google.com, to route your specific request all across the internet so that you can actually get to the Google servers. That ability to convert a common name like google.com to an IP address is what's referred to as a domain name, okay, or domain name system. That's a very, very abstract, kind of analogy for DNS, but I think it works for most people. Another way to look at it is the domain name system that exists out there in the world is basically like a huge, giant telephone book, okay, for every domain that's out there in the internet, whether we're talking about Google, whether we're talking about Microsoft, whether we're talking about Facebook or YouTube or Twitch or whatever the case is. You have to have some way to interpret that human readable name into an IP address. Now let's get a little crazy, okay? Let's get a little technical. Again, not going to scare anybody away, but we're just going to kind of show you, again, kind of to the mantra of demystifying cyber, right? How we want to demystify this. So what do we mean by talking about a domain name, right? We know that this is a domain name, right? But how do we actually interpret that as a domain name? It's very easy. We can use simply like a tool here to make a simple request. And what we get is an IP address. So we've just done a very basic phone book lookup. If anybody on the stream actually, still has a phone book or remembers phone books from back in the day, you were looking for somebody's name, you would simply open up the phone book, you would go by alphabetical order, you'd look for that person's name, and you'd see their telephone number, and you'd pick up the phone and you'd call them. That is exactly what we just did here. We needed to know the phone number for Google, and so we asked the internet what the phone number for Google was, and this is the phone number that it gave us. So what happens on your, kind of on the back end for your browser is when you type in www.google.com, that same type of request occurs and you get a response. And that's what we're looking at here in this image. You as the user make a request. In this case, we're requesting it from Amazon.com. It goes to a server and says, hey, do you know what the IP address is? Hey, do you have this IP address for Amazon.com in your phone book? It either says yes or no. And if it says no, then it goes out to one of these things that's known as a DNS server that says, hey, do you happen to know what the IP address is of Amazon.com? It says, yes, of course I do. I absolutely know what the IP address is. Sends that back to the web server and ultimately sends it back to you as the user. and then you get displayed with in this case Amazon.com. So with that context in mind, you can really kind of see and understand how the domain name system that we have that's out there pretty much runs the internet, right? If it wasn't for our ability to be able to resolve and match common names, common domain names to IP addresses, you would have to remember, this number right here for every website that you wanted to. And that's, if anybody's was around back before we, could store contacts in our cell phones and things like that, it wasn't always the easiest job to try to remember all of the phone numbers for all your friends, when you went to go try to call them. And so the DNS records or the DNS system really kind of helps to facilitate that. Okay. And so when we think about this vulnerability, when we think about this SIG-RED vulnerability, now it starts to become just a little bit more obvious how detrimental this potentially could be to how it is that we do everything on the internet, right? If an attacker is able to change any DNS record, or in this case, they're able to manipulate a piece of code, right, in a way that allows them to take control over a network, that's effectively what we're talking about here with this, okay? So an attacker in this case, and what I think is also worth noting about this, and what we're constantly finding in this cybersecurity space, right, is that this is a 17-year-old bug, right? And that almost sounds, when you say it like that, it almost sounds like you're drinking a fine wine, like, yes, this bug, that's about 17 years old. No, that's a good vintage. Not quite as exquisite when we talk about, exploits and things like that, and whatnot inside of a corporate network. And so, this is something that's been around in the Windows operating system, for about 17 years, right? And so basically since about 2003. And so think about where you were in 2003, and think about how long this has been existing out there, that could have caused terrible havoc across the entire internet, if somebody had found out about it 17 years ago. One of the other things that we want to talk about is that while we showed in the demo kind of DNS holistically, this particular vulnerability really only affects Windows DNS servers. Okay, so I don't say that to try to downplay the criticality of this vulnerability by any stretch of the imagination. When you think about how many Windows machines are out there, I mean, there's a reason why Windows is a multi-billion-dollar company, is because of its predominance, and its adaptability inside of an organization. But in this case, it at least does limit kind of the plume, if you will, kind of how big that that nuclear blast could be, because it is only affecting Windows DNS servers. Most of the non-corporate infrastructure, so things that exist out there on the internet, are comprised of non-Windows DNS servers. So really, we're talking about how this could potentially impact an organization. And so right now, when I'm talking, about the impact of this vulnerability, I'm talking to any, CISOs or incident responders or network admins or folks who may be listening to the stream that are dealing with a corporate environment. We're really talking about you and how these types of systems could be used inside of your corporate environment. One of the other things that I want to highlight about this is that they've deemed this vulnerability what we refer to as wormable. And so what exactly does that mean? If we think about wormable, and if everybody remembers back to 2017, right, when WannaCry kind of hit, right, and what happened was one machine began to get infected, and then 50 machines began to get infected, and then 200 machines began to get infected, and that's what we mean by wormable, right? It's the ability for there to be a piece of malicious code that's written that once it's unleashed into an environment, basically continues to propagate throughout that environment without, much, if any, interaction, with the attacker, with the user, with the outside world, whatever the case is. And so when we look at, again, we get back to how big that plume potentially could be. This is one of those times where a wormable type of virus could be, very big, because it doesn't require a whole lot of interaction. Okay. So we've talked about what DNS is. We've talked about why this vulnerability could be incredibly detrimental to an environment. I want to kind of demystify just a couple of other things for those who may be seeing a report like this for the first time, right? Just in case you have never seen this before, right? And again, just to make sure that we've brought everybody along on this journey with us, right? We talk about CVSS, right? It's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. The NVD, or the National Vulnerability Database, sets these common vulnerability scoring systems, and it's basically a matrix, not like a neo matrix, just like a matrix of, what type of access does it require, how, what type of damage could it be done, what type of access do you need to the network to have this vulnerability be successful. And so 10 is definitely the highest ranking that we have, because it basically means that it's low barrier to entry. It's pretty prevalent, that's out there. It's accessible. It has the ability to affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems and data that exists out there on the network. And so we definitely view this vulnerability as a pretty significant a find and a pretty significant event for all of those reasons.